Imagine walking out of a store with a full shopping cart only to glance at your receipt and feel your stomach drop. Something doesn't add up. That $100 you expected to spend has suddenly become $125 or more. For most people across the world, that moment is no longer rare. It's normal. And here's the terrifying part. What you're feeling isn't a glitch. It's a global phenomenon. And it's just getting started. From New York to London, Sydney to Mumbai, prices are climbing faster than wages. Grocery bills, housing, healthcare, energy, they're all increasing in ways that feel invisible until they hit you like a wave. And yet, the headlines tell a very different story. Inflation down to 2.4%, they say, but that number is only part of the truth. Official statistics measure the speed of price increases today, not the cumulative erosion of wealth that has already happened. That erosion has been happening for years, and the impact is global. Since 2020, U.S. consumer prices have risen over 25%. Rent jumped nearly 29%, and food prices are up 20-25% overall, with meat, dairy, and eggs hitting the hardest. Cities like San Diego, Miami, and Tampa have absorbed cumulative price increases above 30%, affecting millions of households. Across Europe, Germany has seen cumulative inflation over 15% since 2020. Italy, France, and Spain report similar struggles, with energy, food, and housing costs rising faster than wages. In the UK, housing costs alone are up 35%, leaving millions struggling to enter the market. Asia tells a comparable story. In India, food prices jumped 25% over 5 years, with staples like rice, pulses, and dairy hitting historic highs. China's official inflation numbers may look low, but supply chain disruptions, energy costs, and regional shortages mean households are spending far more on essentials than before, and these aren't isolated incidents. Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East have all experienced similar patterns. Brazil and Mexico report double-digit increases in food and energy prices. South Africa faces persistent electricity price hikes. In the Middle East, conflicts and supply chain shocks push local prices higher. The global economy is a web of interlinked systems. When one part wobbles, the effects ripple worldwide. A shortage of eggs in the U.S. affects imports and exports in Asia. Energy shocks in Europe impact manufacturing and shipping in the U.S. Tariffs in one country influence consumer goods prices in another. Take eggs as an example, a staple in kitchens worldwide. In the U.S., a dozen eggs cost under $2 for decades. Then came H5N1 avian influenza in early 2022, leading to the largest bird flu outbreak in U.S. history. Entire flocks were culled, collapsing supply. Prices skyrocketed to $6.23 per dozen by March 2025, triple the historical cost. Europe faced similar disruptions, with droughts, labor shortages, and bird flu pushing egg prices up 40% in Germany, the Netherlands, and Spain. In Asia, outbreaks in India, Thailand, and China caused comparable price surges. The story of eggs isn't about food. It's about the fragility of global supply chains and how a single disruption can ripple through entire economies. And it's not just eggs. Coffee, tea, grains, dairy, meat, all staples have experienced sudden price spikes. Energy costs compound the problem. Europe's electricity bills jumped 60% between 2021 and 2025. Japan's LNG imports surged nearly 50%. South American households face skyrocketing fuel costs. The reality is clear. The global cost of living is increasing, and the increases are accelerating. Housing is where inflation stops being abstract and becomes life-defining. In the U.S., median home prices hit $412,500 in 2024, 5 times the median household income, a historic high. Mortgage rates doubled over a few years, dramatically increasing monthly payments. Nearly 57% of U.S. households cannot afford a $300,000 home today. Compare globally. Canada, Australia, Germany, the UK all face similar affordability crises. In Sydney, median home prices rose over 65% since 2020. Toronto experienced a 60% jump. Even traditionally stable European markets like Germany and Switzerland report rental costs growing faster than wages. The result? Millions of households, particularly younger generations, are priced out of the market. The pressure spreads beyond housing. Credit card debt and consumer borrowing are rising worldwide. In the U.S., outstanding balances reached $1.23 trillion in Q3 2025, with interest rates averaging over 21%. About 68 million Americans carry debt stress, 30% or more of their available credit. Globally, the pattern repeats. UK households report record levels of debt. In Australia, household debt relative to income exceeds 120%. Debt allows people to keep up with rising costs, but it compounds the problem. Minimum payments trap households in long-term cycles of interest accumulation. For millions worldwide, survival means borrowing to maintain a standard of living that their income can no longer support. Adding fuel to the fire, tariffs and trade barriers. The U.S. increased effective tariff rates from 10% to over 23%, the largest jump since 1993. Economists estimate these measures could push consumer prices up 1.5% in 2026 alone, and the impact extends to domestic substitutes as well. Globally, tariffs, sanctions, and trade restrictions have similar effects. European businesses adjust to higher import costs. Asian manufacturers see raw material prices spike. Latin American consumers pay more for imported goods. This is not just a U.S. problem, it's a worldwide driver of rising living costs. Central banks are trying to manage the storm, but the path is uncertain. The Federal Reserve raised rates 11 times between March 2022 and August 2023, then cut them across 2024-2025 to 3.5–3.75%. Chair Jerome Powell openly acknowledges uncertainty. We have an energy shock of some size and duration. We don't know what that will be. Across the globe, central banks face the same dilemma. The European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Reserve Bank of Australia, and the Bank of Japan all struggle to balance slowing growth with persistent inflation pressures. Energy shocks, climate events, and geopolitical tensions amplify uncertainty. Consumers feel it first. In the U.S., the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index registered near all-time lows. In Europe and Asia, confidence indicators show similar pessimism. People are not confused. They know why prices are high. They see the chain reaction, tariffs, disrupted supply chains, energy shocks, and debt obligations converging to make life more expensive. The disconnect between headline inflation and lived experience is stark. A 2.4% rate tells one story. The 6 years of accumulated increases, debt stress, and rising housing costs tell another. What we've described so far is the first wave of the global inflation crisis, the damage already done. Groceries, housing, energy, healthcare, and debt have all been reshaped in ways that most people can feel in their wallets. But beneath the surface, a second wave is forming, and it may hit harder than the first. Tariffs, energy volatility, geopolitical instability, and ongoing supply chain fragility threaten to push prices even higher over the next year. When you leave the store and something feels wrong, it's not just you. It's a system under pressure, and this is only the beginning. When we talk about inflation, most people think of a number, a monthly report, a single percentage on a news ticker. But reality paints a very different picture. Inflation today is shaped by global pressures, geopolitical shocks, policy decisions, and economic uncertainty that go far beyond individual price tags. The official inflation rate may show a modest increase, but that figure only captures the speed of price changes at a point in time, not the accumulated damage already embedded in everyday life and the pressures building underneath the surface. One of the most important pieces of evidence supporting this view comes from global economic institutions. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, a leading global policy group, has revised its inflation forecasts sharply higher for 2026, largely due to disruptions caused by the conflict in the Middle East. Compared with earlier projections, the OECD now expects headline inflation across the G20 to reach around 4% this year, up from previous estimates near 2.8%, an upward revision of more than 1.2 percentage points. This change reflects the impact of higher commodity prices and supply chain disruptions that ripple well beyond the region where the conflict began. This isn't a prediction about one country, it's a regional and global wholesale revision. A higher inflation outlook from the OECD means that policymakers around the world now anticipate persistent cost pressures, not just temporary spikes. In fact, the same report warns that if the conflict continues long enough, global economic growth could be lower than previously forecast, and inflation could remain elevated for longer. Even central banks, those institutions tasked with keeping prices stable, have admitted that uncertainty has increased. In the United States, Federal Reserve leadership has repeatedly noted the challenges of balancing inflation control with broader economic growth in the face of geopolitical risk. Fed Vice Chair Philip Jefferson recently warned that sustained higher energy prices could worsen inflation and dampen consumer spending, making it harder for the central bank to achieve both price stability and full employment. This kind of public acknowledgement from policymakers is rare, and it signals that inflation pressures are not fully behind us. Energy prices are one of the most potent drivers of inflation today, and the evidence is clear. In late March 2026, global oil benchmarks such as Brent crude surged above $150 per barrel, marking a dramatic jump driven by heightened geopolitical tensions and potential disruptions to critical shipping routes like the Strait of Hormuz. These price surges have real effects. They increase transportation costs, push up the cost of producing goods, and filter through to prices on store shelves around the world. Consumers may not feel the latest inflation numbers immediately, but rising energy costs are arguably the gravitational force pulling other prices upward. When crude oil moves sharply higher, everything from airline tickets to food delivery costs rises in its wake. Retailers warn that even modest increases in fuel costs can ripple through supply chains, adding percentage points to overall price levels. That's why economists worry that if energy prices stay elevated, they could ignite secondary inflationary pressures well beyond what headline inflation statistics suggest. Inflation isn't uniform across the globe. Some regions remain closer to official targets, while others are already experiencing renewed price pressures that are difficult to ignore. In Europe, for example, inflation has begun ticking back up after a period of relative calm, driven in part by higher energy costs caused by global disruptions. Recent state-level data from Germany shows inflation climbing in major regions, with rates rising from around 1.8% to nearer 2.8% in March 2026, prompting policymakers to discuss potential rate hikes to prevent inflation from widening. Even countries far from the Middle East are already warning of inflation risks. In New Zealand, the finance minister publicly acknowledged that if the conflict persists and continues to disrupt global supply chains, inflation could rise well above central bank targets this year, surpassing the modest 3.1% already recorded and potentially forcing monetary tightening. Across advanced economies, central banks are walking a tightrope, trying to prevent short-term price shocks from turning into long-term inflation expectations. According to financial analysis from UBS and other institutions, many central banks are expected to hold interest rates steady while delivering hawkish guidance to the markets, signaling that they are prepared to act if inflation broadens beyond energy-related categories. This cautious approach reflects the risk that a premature pivot could reignite broader price pressures. The global inflation story is also being shaped by structural and policy drivers that existed even before the latest conflict. Tariffs and trade tensions have added long-term upward pressure on consumer prices by raising the costs of imported goods. Although tariff rates have moderated from their highest levels, economists still see the legacy impact of trade barriers contributing to inflation in 2026 and beyond, as supply chains and production costs adjust to the new trade environment. In emerging markets, the evidence suggests inflation expectations are rising as well. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, in its World Economic Outlook, reports that 1 year ahead, inflation expectations have increased by 60 basis points in emerging markets, and by around 50 basis points in the United States and other advanced economies. This matters because expectations can feed into real inflation. When businesses and consumers expect higher prices, they adjust their behavior in ways that make inflation harder to tame. All of this is happening against a backdrop of slowing global growth. The IMF also recognizes that the probability of global growth dipping below 2% in 2026 remains a meaningful risk, even as inflation risks stay elevated. This unusual combination, slow growth and rising prices, is precisely what economists fear most because it resembles a scenario known as stagflation, where high inflation and weak growth coexist. Major financial institutions are already grappling with these realities. JP Morgan's Global Economic Outlook, for instance, highlights the likelihood of regional divergences in inflation, even as headline measures appear stable. Some countries may see stronger consumer price pressures than others, depending on energy dependence, labor market conditions, and how much exposure they have to supply chain disruptions. The impact is visible in financial markets, too. Investors are increasingly pricing in a future with higher interest rates for longer to counter inflation that isn't fully controlled. Markets reflect this through bond yields, currency strength, and volatility in equity prices as geopolitical risk premiums rise. Risk-off sentiment and shifts in asset allocations signal that investors no longer view inflation as transient. But what does this mean for everyday life? Evidence shows the disconnect between headline inflation and lived experience continues to widen. Wholesale price data from the U.S. reveals that producer price inflation, costs at the factory gate, rose more than expected recently, with the Producer Price Index increasing 0.7% in a single month, and core PPI, excluding food and energy, showing persistent increases. These upstream pressures often translate into higher consumer prices months later, even when headline inflation appears moderate. In some countries, headline inflation readings may even appear lower year over year due to statistical base effects, but that doesn't mean prices aren't rising in real terms. For example, Canadian CPI recently showed a 1.8% year-over-year increase, driven by base effects due to prior high price increases. Yet many Canadians still report feeling price pressure in groceries, rents, and services that isn't fully represented in that rate. Globally, inflation is increasingly shaped by international factors rather than just domestic conditions. Research indicates that in many advanced economies, inflation vulnerability is more strongly tied to external pressures, such as global commodity prices and foreign supply shocks, than to local economic slack. This underscores why inflation today is a worldwide phenomenon, not a purely national one. Taken together, these data points paint a clear picture. The world is not out of inflation risk. The lull in headline percentages belies deeper forces at work: higher energy prices, elevated trade costs, geopolitical uncertainty, tightening expectations, and persistent supply chain pressures. This is the evidence-based reality behind the lived experience of households everywhere. The first phase of rising prices didn't end. It masked the buildup of deeper inflationary forces. Now, central banks and governments are confronting the fact that inflation can resurface not just through consumer demand, but through external shocks, energy volatility, trade dynamics, and behavioral expectations. And the truth is, unless these forces abate, not just temporarily but sustainably, the global inflation story isn't closing its first chapter. It's entering a new, more complex phase. Even as official inflation numbers seem tame, the real story isn't over. It's evolving. The numbers we see headline after headline simply can't capture the deeper forces reshaping the global economy. The truth is that inflation is no longer a temporary surge or a relic of post-pandemic pressure. It is morphing into a structural challenge that affects everyday life around the world, and the evidence clearly shows it. One of the clearest pieces of global evidence comes from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. In March 2026, the OECD explicitly raised its inflation forecasts for the world's largest economies, not because prices fell, but because global price pressures intensified. Due to prolonged disruption in energy markets and supply chains, the OECD increased its G20 inflation projection for 2026 from around 2.8% to 4%, a dramatic upward revision that reflects how interconnected commodity prices, transportation, and trade really are. This revision means that inflation won't just be a national issue. It will be a global reality felt by ordinary families across continents. What this means in practice is simple but profound. The cost of living is rising everywhere. In the United States, forecasts now suggest inflation could hit 4.2% in 2026, far above the Federal Reserve's prior estimates, driven largely by higher energy costs and ongoing global supply pressures. The OECD warned that this could persist even as growth slows, underscoring the fragile balance policymakers face between price stability and economic growth. And it's not just the US. Around the world, consumers are already experiencing the impacts directly. In the United Kingdom, inflation has climbed above the Bank of England's 2% target, with food, travel, and utility costs pushing households to the brink of affordability. Household confidence has plunged, and millions are cutting back on essentials just to make ends meet. Even if headline inflation appears moderate in some regions, for example, some Canadian statistics showed a CPI increase of 1.8% year over year in February 2026. That figure masks underlying trends where essentials like groceries, shelter, and utilities cost significantly more than before. Many Canadians still feel price pressure far beyond what the headline number suggests. Across the globe, inflation is not just about what household budgets look like today. It's about how those budgets are evolving over time. OECD research shows food prices in advanced economies were already nearly 46% higher than in 2019, long before the latest conflicts. In many developing countries, food represents up to 45% of household spending for low-income families, meaning that global price spikes hit the poorest hardest. Housing costs, too, consume ever larger shares of disposable income in countries across the world. What's more, consumer behavior is shifting in real time. In countries like Australia, surveys show that households are feeling the greatest cost of living pressure in over a decade. Faced with rising grocery bills, utilities, and rent, many households are making deliberate choices, switching providers, cutting discretionary spending, and postponing major purchases, just to stretch their budgets. These decisions don't show up in headline inflation figures, but they do reveal the real human impact of sustained price pressures. The evidence also suggests inflation is becoming less predictable. In some economies, historic price drivers like shelter and services remain stubbornly high, even when goods inflation slows, complicating central bank efforts to manage monetary policy. In Europe, inflation rates have fluctuated, and in some cases, edged up again due to energy price volatility and geopolitical risk, despite efforts to stabilize markets. And while central banks around the world tinker with interest rates to control inflation, they are doing so with one eye on economic growth and another on financial stability. Analysts note that many central banks, including the European Central Bank and the Bank of England, are expected to hold rates steady while signaling readiness to act if inflation broadens beyond current categories. This careful balancing act reflects just how complex and persistent inflation has become globally. Meanwhile, inflation expectations, what businesses and consumers think prices will do in the future, are creeping up in many regions. When expectations rise, prices and wages often follow suit, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that makes inflation harder to break. The International Monetary Fund and other institutions have documented these rising expectations, highlighting the risk that inflation could become more entrenched if economic actors anticipate higher prices over the long term. So what does all this mean for ordinary people? It means that the cost of living is no longer a short-term challenge that will fade when prices normalize. Instead, it's a structural shift in the global economy, one where energy volatility, trade barriers, pandemics, geopolitical conflict, and supply chain fragility all interact to keep pressure on prices for longer than most people realize. It also explains why so many households feel financially squeezed, even when official inflation statistics show modest rates. Those statistics tell part of the story, the speed at which prices are rising, but they don't capture the accumulated cost of living increases, the erosion of purchasing power over years, or how households juggle necessities like food, rent, healthcare, and energy. And that brings us to a critical point. The next chapter isn't about whether inflation is technically low or high according to a number on a chart. It's about how families adapt, how governments respond, and how economies evolve in a world where price pressures no longer behave predictably. Will policies focus on raising real wages and strengthening social safety nets so people can keep up with essential costs? Will investment in energy security and supply chain resilience reduce the vulnerability that fuels price spikes? Or will economies continue to drift into a period where rising prices and stagnant growth, a scenario economists call stagflation, become the new normal? The evidence we see today, from global forecasts, rising living costs, consumer sentiment surveys, and policy revisions, suggests that the world is still in the midst of the inflation story, not at its end. And the chapters yet to be written will determine how millions of people around the world cope with an economic reality that has changed fundamentally. In some sense, the most important lesson is this: inflation isn't just a line on a report. It's the lived experience of people struggling to afford groceries, pay rent, heat their homes, and save for the future. It's reflected in the choices families make every day, many of which are now shaped by forces far beyond their control. And it's a reminder that, in an interconnected world, the cost of living is no longer just a national issue. It's a global challenge that affects us all.